What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is the Two Worlds of Christendom, Chapter 16. First up, our intro. After the fall of the Roman Empire, two very different realms of European Christendom emerged. In the East, the Byzantine Empire managed to flourish politically, economically, and socially. In contrast, Western Europe's economy underwent sharp constriction, and early medieval Europe was a world dominated by rural self-sufficiency and political decentralization. The differences in the two societies also manifested in the ritual and doctrinal differences between the two Christian communities that culminated in a schism between the Eastern and Western churches that exist to the present day. Several unique features of the Byzantine civilization contributed to its prosperity. Number one, a strategically located capital city called Constantinople that was one of the largest, most influential, and cosmopolitan urban centers in the world. Number two, a highly centralized and autocratic governmental structure consisting of an exalted emperor with an aura of divinity and a large and intricate bureaucracy. Number three, a rich Christian tradition elaborated by the emperor and the patriarchs that eventually evolved into an independent and separate faith referred to as Eastern Orthodox. Number four, an unusual and effective administration system whereby generals governed over free peasants who received small tracts of land to work in exchange for military service. And finally, the extension of Byzantine cultural traditions to Eastern Europe and Russia through political, cultural, and economic relations. Now on to the Western side. While other parts of the world were experiencing unprecedented prosperity during the post-classical era, Europe was laying the foundation for the development of the powerful society that would emerge during the High Middle Ages. That foundation rested on the following. Number one, hard-won political order restored out of disruption caused by the fall of the Roman Empire, centuries of destructive invasions, and dramatic depopulation. This order based on a highly decentralized but flexible system that vested political, military, and judicial authority in local and regional rulers. Number two, a long and slow process of economic recovery based first on increased agricultural production, followed by gradually increasing trade, industry, and commerce, and the eventual reurbanization of Europe. And finally, the cultural unity provided by the Christian church based in Rome. During this period, Roman Christianity provided the impetus for cultural community and unity in Western Europe. The office of the papacy and monastic movement were two powerful institutions that helped to preserve Roman traditions and develop and consolidate a uniquely European culture. All right, so first up, I'd like to look at our map of the successor states to the Roman Empire around 600 CE. On the bottom left, you can see it was originally inherited from Christianity from the Roman Empire, and after the 8th century, there were tension between the two halves. This is known as medieval Christendom. And here are the two halves right here. We have it split pretty much down the middle of our map. On the right-hand side, we have the green Byzantine Empire with the Sassanid Empire, which is not having anything to do with medieval Christendom, but more to do with Islamic empires. And on the western half, we have what we call Western Europe. We would call these, during this time, the Germanic states. And on the east, we would call it the Byzantine Empire. By about the year 527, the map looks more like this, with the Byzantine Empire adding more to its empire during 527 to 554 CE. All right, so next we have the early Byzantine Empire. Its capital is Byzantium. It's on the Bosporus, which is next to the Black Sea. It has this thing called the Golden Horn. It's of commercial and strategic value for its location. Now, one of the things that makes it strategically valuable is if you look really closely at where the red square is, that's the Golden Horn, and it creates a narrow passageway of water that can allow you to move up into what is known as the Black Sea. By having this strategic value and holding this position, you can pretty much cut off with different boats, with different kinds of pontoons or anything really in the water to keep ships from passing by without paying taxes, or not allow them to pass by unless they pay taxes. What ends up happening is anyone who holds on to this spot will be seen as someone who controls pretty much all the traffic in or out of basically Russia and far eastern Europe. Constantine, seeing the value of this, moves the capital to the place called Byzantium, renames it Constantinople after himself, and this is all done in 330 CE. By 1453, the city will fall to the Turks, an Islamic group, and it's renamed Istanbul. Next up, we have Caesaropapism. It's a lot like what it sounds. It's Caesar-o-papism. It's the combined power centralized in the figure of the emperor. The Christian leader cannot claim divinity, but rather divine authority. So in the past, we've talked about some leaders that have claimed that they are like the mouthpieces of God or sons of God. This is not what is being argued by the Caesar-o-papism model. What's being argued instead is that as a Christian leader or king, that the emperor can claim a sense of divine authority from God, that God put him in charge, And since God put him in charge, you should not question or fight back or have any kind of ill will towards what God has ordained. So, for example, one of the big cornerstones is political rule. They're in charge of politics, not the church, but they're involved in religious rule as well. Still powerful in the Christian religion. And their authority was absolute. It was unquestionable and supreme. So while there were things like bishops and patriarchs in the areas where Caesaropapism was being practiced, one of the things is that the emperor was not seen as somebody who was in charge of the church, but for sure had a very big influence on what happens within the church because of his power to kind of work with the church in Byzantium. In the Byzantine court, etiquette reinforces the authority of the emperor. For example, we go back to the Roman tradition of the royal purple. The purple was only for senators or for rulers. Prostration, ceremonial, it was done 3 times. You would kiss the hands and feet before rising. I would like you to think a little bit like, what does this sound a lot like? If you said the kowtow ritual, you were right. This goes back to China where we talked about the head knocking on the ground. But there was prostration showing respect for the leader. Mechanical devices were in the Byzantine court, designed to inspire awe. They had mechanical birds that you could add water to and they would sing. They also had lions that were able to power based on certain natural laws of physics that allowed them to be mechanically swooshing their tails without people doing this practice. Pretty interesting at the time, for sure. We then get to the ruler Justinian from 527 to 565 CE. He was known as the Sleepless Emperor because he was pretty much known as always being aware of some of the things that were going on in his empire. He also was really big into ruling, and he was very concerned with how he's being perceived and some of the decisions he was making for his people. He did have his wife Theodora as an advisor. Her background is known as a circus performer. Now, depending on which group of people you talk to or which group of sources you read, she was either a circus performer, meaning that she practiced just normal circus tricks and maybe was like a dancer. But some accounts do make a mention that she was probably closer to like a stripper or a prostitute. And the circus performer act was more of a striptease kind of thing. And so you can read into that what you will. And the idea was with Justinian that he had ambitious construction programs. He built the Church of Hagia Sophia, will be converted to a mosque in the 15th century. I'll show you a picture in a couple slides of Hagia Sophia. And he also did what's called Justinian's Code, codification of Roman law, or simplification. Again, we go back to the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was one of the first people to put down what would happen if you broke a law and what it meant to be punished for breaking those laws. Under Justinian's code, it took all the laws that the Romans had passed and made them simpler and easier to understand, and kind of made certain laws that had contradictory premises to them or contradictory punishments oftentimes were simplified and made clearer through this process. And I'd like to show you a picture. There is Theodora right there. Nice looking lady. Here is Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom from modern day. It is a mosque today, but you can see this grand architecture. I remember watching a documentary one time, seeing that the Church of Hagia Sophia was a modern marvel in the sense that they were unable, even to this day, to really kind of understand how the dome structure was able to be built. The way domes are built is usually you build the skeleton of the scaffolding. You then place bricks and mortar on top, and the arch of the dome presses into kind of like the center, and by pressing all equal weights and all equal sides and times, the dome doesn't fall because the pressure is always being forced together towards the center, and the dome stays up. And you only really know that once you take the dome scaffolding away. And when I watched this documentary, it showed how even these modern engineers who were trying to figure out how to rebuild it were having a very difficult time doing it so well. And remember, this could be a huge disaster if it wasn't built absolutely perfectly. We then get to Byzantine Conquests, effort to reconquer much of Western Roman Empire from the Germanic peoples after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire kind of saw itself as just doing its own thing, continuing what the Roman Empire was known for. They still had an emperor. They still had lots of the Roman-esque type of life going on. They spoke Latin, but they were unable to consolidate control of the territories, and eventually, through this process, they abandoned Rome. They built a new capital in Ravenna, which will become the new capital for the Western Roman Empire, but these Byzantine Conquests were in an effort to try and conquer back from those barbarians some of the things that were taken in the original sieges of Rome in the Western Roman Empire. Next, we get Muslim conquest, 7th century Arab Muslim expansion. They will besiege Byzantium from 674 to 678, and also again from 717 to 718. Their defense of Byzantium was made possible through the use of kind of this old kind of recipe for what was known as Greek fire. Now, Greek fire is interesting because it's basically a really interesting chemical compound that's like oil-based. It was said to actually have been able to burn on top of water. It wasn't able to be put out with water, and it was pretty much a secret for the people living in Byzantium that were able to fight back against those Muslim invaders during the time. The theme system are provinces under the control of generals. There are themes. They had military administration, meaning they were run by the military generals, and the control came from central imperial government, whereas the administration part, or the running of the day-to-day kind of style of that time, was through the military administration of the governors. Soldiers were from the peasant class, were rewarded with land grants for working very hard under the theme system. So what would happen is the central imperial government would give generals themes or provinces under their control. It would then be run as a military part of the society, and it would be run by the generals from the military. Then soldiers could choose to be a part of the government, or peasants could choose to be part of the army, and when they came back from war, or after a certain amount of time, they were then rewarded with land grants where they could start their own farms. The Germanic successor states. The last Roman emperor was deposed by Germanic Odoacer or Odovaker from 476 CE. He's there in the winged helmet, and Romulus Augustulus is him on his knees down there handing over the crown. The administrative apparatus was still in place, but cities lose population. Basically, the thing Odovaker or Odoacer decides to do is to set up the same system that the Romans had and not really change it to a barbarian type system, but the cities run away because they understand the barbarians are now invading, and they stop to see the value in being in Rome or in a Roman province. So what ends up happening is there's Germanic successor states such as the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, and the Franks that take over in the place of the Roman administration. We get the Franks, heavily influence on European development 5th to 9th century. Conversion to Christianity gains popular support, and they have a firm alliance with the Western Christian Church based out of Rome. Next, we get the Carolingians from the Franks. Charles the Hammer Martel begins the Carolingian dynasty. He will defeat the Spanish Muslims at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE, and he halts the Islamic advance into Western Europe. At this time, Islam had been growing. It had spread throughout most of the Middle East, most of Arabia, northern Africa, spread up into Spain, and that's where those Moors that we've talked about in the past were based out of, and the Moors were pushing into what we now call Central Europe. And Charles the Hammer Martel is somebody who fought back against the Spanish Muslims at the Battle of Tours, stopping the Islamic advance into Western Europe, basically solidifying why Europe did not become part of Dar al-Islam in the 700s. Without this battle, it is pretty safe to say that Europe would have a larger Muslim population than it does right now, because the Spanish Muslims would have pushed into from Tours and pushed into Central Europe, spreading Islam and encompassing Central Europe into Dar al-Islam. Here is a picture of Charles the Hammer Martel. He's the dude with the big axe looking all boss there. And here's a map showing the Carolingian Empire and the Battle of Tours right about where it would have been. Stopped at the River Ebro. Then we get to Charlemagne. He ruled from 768 to 814. He's the grandson of Charles Martel. He centralizes imperial rule. He was basically illiterate. He couldn't read, but he sponsored extensive leadership. He had major military achievements, bringing him favor in the eyes of the people, but also expanding his rule and his reign. Under his administration, he set up his capital at Aachen, Germany. He had constant travel throughout the empire. This is like what Indian ruler? There was an Indian ruler we talked about that constantly traveled throughout the empire, meeting with the people and meeting his advisors. What do you think it sounds like? If you said Harsha, you were correct. The imperial officials were known as Missi Dominici, or envoys of the Lord Ruler. They would basically continue a yearly circuit of travel. Here's how it would work. The idea behind the Missi Dominici was that it was kind of impossible to have a really good administrative structure if we just stationed people in the same place all the time. That could lead to corruption, that could lead to miscommunication, and basically we could have local administration based off of whatever that imperial official said for that region. But with the Missi Dominici, by traveling around, they could basically stop by, have people show up and say, hey, last time you guys were here was like 2 months ago. We have some things we need you to rule on. So we have some court cases we need you to talk about. We have some questions about the laws that you bring. We have some taxes to pay. And once they did all their administrative duties, they would then move on to the next town or the next region, and they would continue this process. This ensured a couple of things. Number one, it would ensure that the people were constantly visited, and it could be a surprise. So they always had to be kind of like not doing anything corrupt or inciting rebellion, or it's possible that the Missi Dominici could report back to the king, and they could have some problems from the government. And secondly, it also helps to keep corruption down. If the Missi Dominici are constantly traveling and constantly moving around, there's no guarantee you can just bribe them because they're not really in charge. It still goes back to the central imperial government that's in charge, and those people are just kind of like ambassadors, and they don't really have a ton of power other than to like do a couple things like collect taxes and do some rulings on court cases, but mostly they answer to Charlemagne. Charlemagne as emperor hesitated to challenge the Byzantines by taking the title emperor. He is in the Western European section, but at this time the Byzantines still see themselves as the heirs to the Roman legacy of Caesar, or emperor. And even though Charlemagne was not willing to call himself Emperor Charlemagne, he did rule as the emperor of the larger region of Central Europe out of the Frankish kingdom. Pope Leo III crowns him as emperor in 800, and some people argue that this was planned in advance, and it was a challenge to Byzantium. If Byzantium claims that they are the rightful heirs to the empire after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, after Romulus Augustus gives up his crown to Odoacer and the Germanic peoples, then the Byzantium claims that they are the continuation of the Roman Empire. Yet when Charlemagne comes onto the scene, he argues that he is the rightful heir to the crown that was once Julius Caesar's. He is one of the Caesars or emperors that continues this legacy of Rome. So it's a challenge. Who really is in charge of the larger area known as the former Roman Empire? And so let's look at this account. This is the account of Einhard, Vita, Caroli, Magni. I don't know what that means, but yeah, the account of Einhard. Charlemagne came to Rome to restore the condition of the Roman Church, which had been very much disturbed, and spent the whole winter there. At that time, he received the title of Emperor and Augustus. See that cornerstone little caveat that's a part of the Roman Empire? Though he was so much opposed to this at first that he said he would not have entered the church that day if he had not been able to foresee the Pope's intention, although it was a great feast day. Nevertheless, he endured patiently the envy of the Roman Eastern emperors who were indignant about his accepting the title, and by sending many embassies to them and addressing them as brothers in his letters, he overcame their arrogance by his magnanimity, in which he certainly excelled them. So what this little section is arguing is that according to Einhard, Charlemagne was so humble and so blown away and so surprised that the Pope crowns him as emperor in the year 800 that Charlemagne is almost embarrassed by the fact that he has made Caesar and Augustus through this process. But in being the awesome person that he is, Charlemagne sends off some envoys to say, look, brothers, Christian brothers, don't you understand that in my accepting the title of Emperor and Augustus, I have not forgotten about you. And those emperors were kind of not happy. So this account can be seen in one of two ways. It can be seen as being, yeah, maybe Charlemagne was humbled and maybe he was somebody who was blown away by this process. Or you could read it that we need to have a good story to say why we the Pope and Charlemagne's people got him to be in that church at that day to be crowned emperor. And one of the things that it comes down to is if you're the Western Church, you want to have as much like proximity to the power as possible. And so by naming Charlemagne, who's a Frank in the West, the emperor, you don't really have to look to Byzantium for anything. If you're the Bishop of Rome, which will eventually become the Pope, you want the person who has a lot of power as close to you as possible so you two can kind of team up and work on things together. And so this account can be seen as kind of sarcastic. It can also be seen as very sincere. It just depends on which way you want to look at it. Next is the Carolingian Empire. Here's a map of it. You have the Caliphate of Cordoba on the left, and you have Britain doing its own thing up in the north, and then you have Moravia in the east, and then you have it going all the way down to the Papal States with Rome and the Byzantine territories pushing up at Monte Cassino. So that's what the Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne will roll over looks like. Then we get to Louis the Pious. He rules from 814 to 840. He's the son of Charlemagne. He, as usual, of sons of great men, lose control of the courts and local authorities, and a civil war erupts among three sons. What's this sound like? Which person does this sound like? If you said Alexander the Great and his generals, you would be correct. The empire was divided in 843. So again, empire dividing, because Louis the Pious, shown there as a tiny little boy, wasn't able to keep control. There were invasions that came after this in the Carolingian Empire. From the south, we had Muslims. In the east, we had the Magyars. In the north, we had the Vikings. And we have Norse expansion driven by population pressure and quest for wealth. When I talk about the Norse, we're talking about the Vikings, same thing. And they're basically having too many people up in that northern part that they live in Scandinavia, and they're also looking for stuff to go and get, like wealth. And they had very superior seafaring technologies. The Vikings come from the village of Vik, Norway, hence Viking. The boats with shallow drafts were capable of river travel as well as open seas. One of the things that was pretty well assured was, if you lived on the coast, that's where most of your fortifications would have happened. You would have chosen to defend any big boats coming your way. You also would have chosen to make sure that you had army stationed to prevent people from coming onto the land. But the problem with that is that the Vikings had improved their ships in a very specific way. They created shallow drafts, or the bottom of their boat wasn't very deep. It wasn't super pointy. It was actually only a few feet into the water, and yet it was still able to float and hold lots of people. With having this, they're able to travel upriver, and if you look at the map of Europe, there are tons of rivers all over the place. If you get an ancient map of Europe, you can see there's lots of little rivers all over the place, and one of the things that they could do is, at night, or whenever, just row upriver and attack the cities from behind, and all their defenses are on the other side by the sea, and you could basically show up, raid the town, grab whatever they wanted, and get back in their boats and row away. So the Vikings attacked villages, cities, and monasteries from the 9th century. They were able to sack Constantinople 3 times. They were able to accomplish something that the entire Muslim empire that we talked about before was unable to do. They actually were able to go upriver into Constantinople, sack the city, and leave 3 different times. The Carolingians had no navy and were dependent on local defenses. That also doesn't help that you have no navy to fight off a bunch of people that come in boats. Here is an example from like a little toy version of a Viking boat. You can see that the bottom of the boat isn't very deep in comparison to the total size of the boat. So they could basically row upriver, use sails or rowing techniques, and get up to where they need to be. We then get to the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire in 843 CE and the invasion of early medieval Europe in the 9th and 10th century. We see the kingdom of Charles the Bald is in purple. We see the kingdom of Louis the German in yellow, and green the kingdom of Lothar. And then we see the Muslims running around all over the south. We see the Magyars coming in from the east, and we see the Vikings just pretty much going everywhere there is water. So pretty crazy there, right? Economy in medieval Christendom. Byzantium was an economic powerhouse. It had an agricultural surplus. It also did engage in long-distance trade. Western Christendom, on the other hand, had repeated invasions contribute to agricultural decline. By the 10th century, increased political stability leads to economic recovery. So at the beginning, Byzantium is doing great, and it's able to engage as a part of the Silk Road network and some of the Indian Ocean trade. Western Christendom, which we would talk about as like Central Europe before, where like the Carolingians and the Franks were, they weren't doing too good because of all these invasions. And by the 10th century, they figure some stuff out with political stability, but it takes all the way until basically the 900s. Here's a picture of the Byzantine peasantry. Free peasants kept Byzantium strong. They were supported by the theme system, and there was a decline after the 11th century, and the wealthy accumulated large estates. We're going to see a shift here in the Byzantine peasantry model. Free peasants are basically people who work the land like farmers, but pay rent through their farming. And in Byzantium, it was able to keep Byzantium strong because the free farmers were just as much a part of the process as the landlords and landowners. if you don't have people to go out and farm to keep themselves alive, but also to make themselves some money, then you don't have a surplus of agriculture. So by doing this, the theme system is supported, and eventually there's a decline in the 11th century, whereby the wealthy can get large estates, and we're going to see, like we've seen in the past, some problems with the wealthy just consolidating all the land for farming. Get to manufacturing and trade in Byzantium. Trade routes bring key technologies, specifically the silk industry. Advantage of location causes crafts and industry to expand after the 6th century. The Byzant, which is pictured here, it's this type of coin, becomes a standard currency. The good thing about having a standardized currency is when trading goods, you can know how much a single thing is worth. If you know, for example, $1 will buy you 1 foot of silk, then you can compare that $1 buying 1 foot of silk with like $1 will buy you 1 pound of rice. I'm just making this up. If those were your exchange rates, you could think to yourself and say, that sounds fair, or no, that doesn't sound fair. And by using a standard currency like the Byzant, you're able to do calculations easier in terms of making money, in terms of trade, and this makes things a lot easier. There were also tax revenues from the Silk Route, and so Byzantium's gaining tax revenues. They're spreading their influence all over what we call Eastern Europe during this time, and they're also engaging in trade along the Silk Road. Manufacturing and trade in Western Europe. Invasions and political turmoil disrupt commercial activities. They are unable to pretty much establish themselves in terms of being a part of the larger trade networks. Agricultural innovations happen, however. There's the heavy plow, which is like an iron plow that goes in the ground. It splits the earth, so you can put seeds down in the earth a little deeper. You attach it to a horse, and he drags it. There were water mills, where water spins the mill that's based inside of a house along the side of a river, and the water traveling down the river spins the wheel on the side of the house, and inside of the house, that energy is used to turn some of the wheat and grind it up into what is needed for flour or used for grain. And they also invent what's known as a special horse collar. Before, what they would do is take a rope and just tie it to a horse, and it would cause a lot of pressure and strain, and it would wear the horse out more, whereas the special horse collar is kind of like a collar that you have on your shirt. It sits back on your shoulders, and it doesn't choke the horse anymore, and the horse is able to pull heavier loads more efficiently, and it helps to get the weight off of the horse's neck. They also do small scale exchange, and they do a little bit of maritime trade in the Mediterranean. We then get to the Norse merchant mariners, commerce or plunder as convenience. So sometimes they were traders, sometimes they were pirates. It just depended on what they felt like at the time. And they have a link with the Islamic world for trade. We have silver from the Abbasid Empire that they were interacting with. So it's super interesting to see that the Abbasid Empire silver made it all the way back up to the Norse merchant mariners area, showing that they were actually able to trade very large distances even before we have some of the better sailing technologies of later years. In Byzantium, there was urban society. The aristocrats built palaces. The artisans or craftspeople worked in apartments or lived in apartments, which were like apartments today, multiple stories, small rooms that you could live in. And the working poor just had communal living spaces. Think of huts with multiple families living inside of them, or buildings with like 4 families living inside of them. So it wasn't great for the working poor. It was okay for the artisans, and it was really good for the aristocrats. They also built this thing known as the Hippodrome, shown in the picture in the background. It's a big, like, oval-shaped racetrack. They had chariot races where they actually had the greens versus the blues, and people would root for their specific team. So if they thought the greens were better, they would wear green, and they would show up to the races and watch the greens do battle with the blues. And if you were a blue fan, then you would be someone who shows up and watch the blues fight it out with the greens. And there was also some politically inspired rioting, which showed that people were talking about politics and being motivated enough to actually start breaking things. So, kind of an interesting society to be growing up in Byzantium. Next, we get to Western Europe. This is a rural society. There's the concept of feudalism, lords and vassals. I want you to kind of put a star by this. There are those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. Pictured here on the left, we have those who work. In this system, there was kind of this triangle of support. There was the peasants who worked for farming and made the grain and the food for the people. And then what they would do is they would pay the lord of the land for the privilege of farming on the land, but also give that farm goods like grain to the lord, And what would happen is whenever barbarians or the Vikings would show up, the lords would go out and they would stab all the Vikings. So in exchange for the workers working on the land, they only had to pay a certain amount of money certain amount of goods that they grew to be protected by the lords. In addition to the system, you have those who pray, those who became monks or became part of the church. Their belief at this time was that the society was in need of the church and Jesus specifically. And they hadn't really hammered out 100% that God was like a personal, relational kind of God that most Christianity embraces today. And so what they believed was, while the people work and the big lords and guys fight, the knights fight, we need a group of people to pray for us and pray for our sins and teach us about the Bible and do all the knowledge stuff, and they'll help us like get our sins forgiven and teach us the life that we need to live to be like that Jesus guy that we learned about. This is an increasingly inadequate model for describing complex societies. It's basically ad hoc, or means like impromptu or spontaneous arrangements in the absence of strong central authorities. Because there wasn't a strong sense of like rallying troops to come defend the town in time, a lot of times these lords and vassals were ready to fight at a moment's notice. The peasants were people who wanted to just like live as best they could with the circumstances, and the monks were people who were basically not having to pay any taxes, but made sure that they studied, learned about the Bible, and taught the people and gave them church every Sunday and did a lot of like the marriage and baptism stuff that they were supposed to do. So everybody had a job and they were all working together to make their community work. Organizing in a decentralized society, local nobles take over the administration from weak central government. I think you've heard this sentence before many, many times. Nominal allegiances, meaning that they sometimes had allegiances and sometimes they didn't, especially to Carolingian kings. So if the lords felt like the Carolingian kings could help them, they made alliances. If they didn't really feel like they could help them, they kind of broke the alliances whenever they felt like it. But there was a move towards increasing independence by these local nobles. We then get lords and retainers. These lords form private armies. There are incentives. If you fight with me when the Vikings show up or the barbarians or whoever shows up, I will give you land. And you get income from the mills that are run by the peasants, and I'll even pay you in like cash payments of like gold or Byzant or silver or whatever. And so if you were somebody who was willing to fight alongside of a lord and train yourself, well then you could gain a lot of good things in your life. This is where we get the formation of hereditary class of military retainers. If your dad was a military retainer, then you were probably somebody who would be a military person. Your father would teach you about using weapons, riding a horse, fighting barbarians, and this starts to lead to a process of that's your education. So you will grow up to be a knight just like your father before you. And it developed other functions. For example, there was justice and social welfare. This is where we get the idea of like the chivalrous knight. The knight is somebody who goes around and fights injustice. They slay evil dragons who are hurting people. They also are supposed to provide social welfare. So like if they hear of damsels in distress, or they hear that a community is being attacked by a barbarian king and he rules over them with an iron fist, then their job is to go and help the people. And that's their duty as good lords and retainers. And so, that changes how people look at the world in terms of knights, and that's where we get a lot of the folklore that we talk about. We next get peasants' rights and obligations. There's an obligation to provide labor and payments in kind to the lord. This is kind of what I talked about before, but they were unable to move from the land. So let's say your lord was very mean and he asked like half of what you grew every year for payment to work on his land. Well, because you were kind of stuck on the land, you couldn't really move, and the lord, you actually had to get permission from the lord to leave your land. It wasn't just as simple as like, I don't want to work for you anymore. There is examples of fees being charged for marrying serfs from another lord. So if there were two pieces of land close enough to each other, but like you so happen to fall in love with that pretty girl across the way that belongs to another lord, or that handsome boy from across the way that belongs to another lord, one of you would have a fee charged for going off and marrying, because what you're basically doing is taking away labor from one of those lords. One of you will choose to work over in the other lord's parts of their land, and you need to pay that original lord to be able for the privilege to leave your land. Still kind of messed up. It's not true slavery, but it's getting close. Population growth in Christendom during 5th and 6th century, population fluctuated. By the 8th century, there's demographic recovery based on two things, political stability and productive agriculture. Basically, people stop stabbing each other, and they get a lot more food. As always, when calories increase. Population growth of Europe, 200 to 1000 CE. See, it kind of dips off around 600, goes back up around 1000 to 36 million. We then get the evolution of Christian societies. Christianity is the main source of religious, moral, and cultural authority. We don't really know a ton of people during this time that were Islamic in those areas. They were around, but they weren't the predominant religion at this time. The two halves, specifically the Byzantine version of Christianity and the Roman version of Christianity, disagree on doctrine, ritual, and church authority. Doctrine: how should we believe the things about what we believe? Ritual: what should we do when we practice church? What should we do for baptism? What should we do for whatever we do with like religious ceremonies? And church authority: who's actually in charge? The Pope or the bishop in Rome, or the patriarch or the guy with the other awesome hat in Byzantium? By the mid-11th century, there are two rival communities. There's the Eastern Orthodox, which is based out of Byzantium/Constantinople, and the Roman Catholic Church, based out of course, Rome. All right, so we're going to now talk about Pope Gregory I. He is the Pope from 590 to 604 CE. He's a Catholic, so he's western half of Europe. He will then eventually become known as Gregory the Great. He asserts papal primacy. His lasting contribution to world history is that he believes that the Pope, in Rome specifically, is the supreme leader of all Christians. If there's a dispute to be made, he is the one who's going to make it. If there is a dispute in terms of how people should practice or what they should think or how to interpret a piece of scripture, the Pope is the final word on earth from God. He was a prominent theologian, meaning somebody who was very well versed in the study of the Bible, and he invents the sacrament of penance, which is confessing your sins to a priest for forgiveness. So penance is supposed to be, you confess your sins to a priest, you say, Father, I have sinned, it's been like 2 months since my last confession. You then tell all your sins to the priest. The priest will say, okay, usually it's involved with whatever kind of related to what you've done. So let's say you lied. That's a sin. And so what you're supposed to do is you say, okay, Father, I lied to my mom about eating the cookie in the kitchen, and I wasn't supposed to eat the cookie in the kitchen, and when she asked if I ate it, I told her I didn't. So that was a lie. So what the priest might say is, my son, you need to go back to your mother, confess your sin to her, and then you need to go give some money to the food shelter to make sure that other people can eat just like you were able to eat. So usually penance is related to kind of whatever you did wrong. So since it was about lying and about stealing food, your retribution or way of giving back is to go and do something that kind of counterbalances or counteracts your sinful action. So in the example, giving back food or money to food banks. We then get the Byzantine Church. The church and state are closely aligned. The Byzantine emperors appoint patriarchs, treated as a department of state. The Byzantine emperors appoint patriarchs. These are basically bishops or leaders of the church. Now, here's what's really interesting. In the West, the Pope is kind of doing his own thing in Rome, and the bishops do their own thing, and they run the church by themselves with their own way of electing and bringing people into the church. At the same time, we have the Carolingians, we have a lot of these emperors in the West who are doing their governmental stuff, but they're not always interacting with one another and telling each other what to do. They're very close. They work together on a lot of things, but basically the emperor does not tell the Pope what to do, and the Pope does not tell what the emperor to do, and they don't always have to listen necessarily. But with the Byzantine Church, the Byzantine emperors actually say who's going to be in charge of the church in the form of patriarchs. And they actually treat the patriarchs as employees of the government. They actually instructed patriarchs, priests, and bishops to deliver sermons in support of the state government. So if the emperor out of Constantinople says that everybody needs to do this new thing that has to do with taxes, well, he would then tell the patriarchs and the priests and bishops to support the new tax initiative from the pulpit. And on Sunday, when you would go to church, you would hear a sermon saying, we need to do what's right by Jesus, and we need to help out God. And a part of doing that would be paying your taxes, and this new tax is going to help us do that. And so you just nod usually and go along with it. Caesaropapism creates dissent in the church. There's issues over in charge. over who's in charge. If the Byzantine emperors are the ones who appoint the patriarch, then who really is actually in charge? If the emperor says that the patriarchs get to be in charge, doesn't that make the emperor more in charge of the church than the patriarchs themselves? So that's a problem of who elects who. We then get to the issue of iconoclasm. Emperor Leo III, who reigned from 717 to 741 CE, called for the destruction of icons after 726 CE. So icons in the Eastern Church are little pictures or paintings on the wall, and what you're supposed to do is stare at them. Here's an icon on the left, and you're supposed to contemplate things. So you look at them, and during your prayer time, you can stare at baby Jesus and think about, oh yeah, he was a baby, and that can help me with my faith. I need to be like a child. Or you can look at some of the pictures of the guys down below and the saints, and you can remember their stories, and it helps you to kind of space out a little bit and remember the stories. And maybe you'll find encouragement from God through this process, and you see the angels, and it's just kind of a way to look at a picture and think through some of the things that are in the picture. Well, when they destroy icons, because in the Bible it does say you're not supposed to make graven images, that's how Emperor Leo sees it, there's a popular protest and there is rioting. The people get pissed off, and they say that no longer do they want to listen to this destruction of icons thing, and the policy eventually gets abandoned by 843 CE. We then get to the idea of asceticism, that monks and nuns practice a hermit-like existence. So some of them do decide to live alone in the wilderness, meaning they live away from society that would distract them from their focus on God and Jesus and becoming better and more acquainted with their religious practice. They also practice celibacy, meaning no sex. They believe that as monks or as nuns, sex just takes away your focus on Jesus and your prayer life, and so what you need to do is not have sex to focus, not just have no sex, but also not be married for many of them. They also believe in fasting, which is not eating for a long period of time. They believe that there's a verse in the Bible that talks about man does not live by bread alone, but every word that comes out of the mouth of God, that people would not need to eat, but instead focus on God, and that will sustain them. And they would practice this to make sure that they were contemplating what God wanted for them and showing some sort of sacrifice rather than constantly filling themselves and focusing on food in the next meal. And they would practice prayer. There would be hours or even days at a time where they would pray for 8 hours a day. Go to sleep, wake up the next day, pray for another 8 hours, and have no food in between. And they would do this in the middle of the wilderness and just try and connect themselves with God. So this is asceticism. We then get a couple saints that are during this time. Now, a saint is just a holy person that the church has deemed to be a model for other Christians to follow. We have Saint Basil, who lived from 329 to 379 CE, and Saint Benedict from 480 to 547 CE. Both established consistent rule for monasteries. What that means is they established the rules or the rule book for how monasteries or where the monks live. They believed in a couple things. Number one, poverty, meaning that they believed that monks should not be ostentatious. They should not be people who have lots of gold, lots of money. They basically should just own robes and prayer books and maybe their Bible and just kind of just read that all day, and then they will be happy. They also believed in practicing chastity, meaning that you didn't get married and you didn't have sex ever, because your focus should be on God, and this is a bigger commitment. In this life, if you focus on God, you'll be rewarded in the next one with an eternal afterlife of awesome things with God. And in their mind, being with God was better than sex. And obedience, that you are placed under a certain group of monks, and there's a head monk or an elder monk, and you're supposed to respect that monk and make sure that you do everything they tell you so that you can learn the ways of the order or the group of monks. There's also at this time Saint Scholastica, who's pictured here. She is the sister of Saint Benedict, and she takes basically the Benedictine rule or rules for the monks and converts them to a set of rules for the nuns. And so these three basically set up how monastic or ascetic communities will work going forward for the Catholic Church. Monasticism and Society. There were social welfare projects as a part of being more in tune with God. Their belief was that Jesus did a lot of things to help, for example, people who were sick. So they would build hospitals. They also have this idea that some people, like kids who had lost their parents, they opened orphanages to take care of those kids as a part of their duties. Since they don't have families of their own and they can't have kids, this was their way of giving back to society. They also worked at inns, taking care of travelers, because there is a couple verses in the Bible that talk about sojourners or travelers in your land and making sure they're well taken care of and not harmed. They are also agents in the spread of Christianity. They establish what's known as missionaries. They set up a Christian cultural zone in the western part of the Eurasian continent. These missionaries go out, they tell people the good news or the gospel of Jesus, and the idea is that they tell people about Jesus and they pray for them and they try and convert them to believing in the story of Jesus, and that will save their soul if they have faith in Jesus for dying on the cross. They spread all the way to England, northern Germany, eventually to Scandinavia. There's an influence on Slavic cultures. St. Cyril and Methodists, they are more in the eastern side of this equation. Their original people we were talking about were more in the west, and so the St. Cyril and Methodists set up missions in Bulgaria and Moravia, and they actually create what's called the Cyrillic alphabet, which is pictured here on the right. It will form the basis of Russian today. And the Slavic lands develop orientation towards Byzantium. And finally, Prince Vladimir of Kiev converts. And so it's kind of showing there's this eastern and western split along the lines of who's actually in charge. Is it the Byzantine Church or the Roman Church? And by the Byzantines setting up this missionary project to the east with St. Cyril and Methodist, and the conversion of Prince Vladimir of Kiev, all of the Slavic lands like east of France and east of Germany pretty much start to look towards Byzantium as their center for spiritual faith, based out of Constantinople. Tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity. There are ritual disputes. Should there be beards on clergy? In the Western tradition, they believe that beards should not be a part of your religious practice. They think that a priest should be shaven for whatever reason. Whereas in the East, it's very, 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 very common for the priest of an Eastern Orthodox church to have a really long beard. Should they have leavened bread for Mass? In the Passover description that Jesus is participating in, the Western Church says that it was during Passover. And during Passover, you don't eat bread with yeast in it. And so to be more authentic and to be closer to what Jesus did, the Western Church says they're not going to eat leavened or yeast-filled bread, and that's why you take communion with those little wafers. In the East, they believe that you should have leavened bread because it's more about the symbol than it is about the specifics of the Passover ritual, and it has more spiritual implications to having leavened bread in the Eastern Church. There were also theological disputes. The West believed that iconoclasm, or the icons, were bad, and that we're not supposed to make graven images, so we should destroy all of them, and people should just contemplate Jesus and pray by themselves with their eyes closed. Whereas in the East, they believe that the icons were good, and that the icons should be in all different places to encourage people to pray, to remind them to pray, to be visible reminders of what they're supposed to be doing or who they're supposed to be, like to show pictures of saints, for example, or the pictures of Jesus, and reminding us oh yeah, that's what our lives should be about. And finally, they argued about the nature of the Trinity, the three parts of God in one. In the Western Church, there's a lot of different interpretations depending on what Western tradition you fall into, if you're a Protestant or if you're a Catholic. But basically, they argued that there were different ways of interpreting how God made Jesus. Did he make him? Was he there from the very beginning? Was Jesus always around when God was there? Because in the first verses of the Bible, it talks about let us make man in our image. It's a plural form of the words that are used there. And so some Christians point to that as see, Jesus was there the whole time. And in the Eastern Church, they don't argue that Jesus was there from the very beginning, but Jesus was begotten or made for the purpose of saving people of their sins. So it just depends on which orientation you're kind of looking at. Eventually, we get to what is known as a schism or a splitting. These arguments come to a head over hierarchy, who's in charge, jurisdiction, where are they in charge, the autonomy of the patriarchs or the primacy of Rome. Were the patriarchs allowed to do whatever they want and teach however they want and kind of instruct people however they want? Or should we have to listen to the guy in Rome with the hat? In 1054, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome excommunicate each other or kick each other out of the church. And I know it seems silly today, but basically they said, you can't be in my church, and the other one said, well, you can't be in my church. And so they make their own churches. The eastern one becomes known as the Orthodox Church, and the west becomes the Roman Catholic. And interestingly enough, Orthodox means proper practice, meaning someone who is properly practicing church. And in the West, they call themselves the Roman Catholic Church, and Catholic means universal for all places and all times. So basically, their names are saying similar things while meaning different ideas. We have reached the end, one of the longest units that we have ever talked about. When you finish studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Number 1, discuss the development of the early Byzantine Empire. Number 2, explain the effects of the Muslim conquest on the Byzantine Empire. Number 3, explain the rise of the Franks. Number 4, explain the factors that contribute to the success of the Vikings in toppling the Carolingian Empire. Number 5, compare and contrast the economies of Byzantium and Western Europe. Number 6, compare and contrast social development in Byzantium and Western Europe. Number 7, compare and contrast the ways in which popes and patriarchs exercise their political power. Number 8, identify the role of monks, monasteries, and missionaries in Christianity. And number 9, discuss the factors that led to the schism between the two worlds of Christendom and the paths followed by the two churches. Here's our writing assignment, 5 questions this week. Writing assignment, write a short response, 5 to 8 sentences to the following question using specific examples from the textbook. Number 1, even though Byzantine Empire fell in 1453 and was in decline for centuries before that, it left a strong legacy behind. What was the most important contribution that Byzantium made to world history? Why is it the most important? Kind of an opinion question. Number 2, what role did geographic location play in the history of Byzantium? Super easy, go all the way back to the beginning. What were its advantages and disadvantages? Number 3, what were the advantages and disadvantages of the highly decentralized political system that developed in Europe during this period? Number 4, the economy of Europe underwent sharp constriction after the fall of the Roman Empire. What was the nature of that constriction? Where and how was the economy still functioning? And finally, what impedes the impediments to economic development? And 5, what was the role of Roman Christianity in early medieval Europe? How did it shape the society? What were the principal channels of influence? As always, it's been great talking to you. New little smiley down at the bottom. It's time to reread your chapter. I hope this finds you well. I'll see you next time when we go on to chapter 17. Thanks. Bye.
What we do here is go back.